Okay, so to make your raspberry buns or your alternatives of those, you will need one sieve if you've got one. Don't worry if you haven't, you can do it without. A decent sized mixing bowl. You'll need just a table knife, don't need a sharp knife. So you can either use one like this, or I've got some proper like traditional baking knives like this, which are completely blunt. You will need a fork. You'll need a teaspoon, which a teaspoon is the small one that you would stir your tea with, not the big ones. A set of scales, so they can either be digital ones or traditional style ones which use giant weights like this. You will need a grater or a zester if you're doing a lemon or an orange version that uses orange or lemon zest. You'll need a wooden spoon or something that's got like a rounded end on it. You can even use your finger, to be honest. You'll need a mug or a small bowl. You'll also need at least one or two even baking trays. It depends on the size. These ones are quite big baking trays. If they're smaller baking trays, you might need two. And you need 2 pieces of greaseproof paper, which is roughly the size of your tins. As you can see, mine fits inside the tins. If you haven't got greaseproof paper, you could use some sort of baking fat to grease the tray, or a little bit of flour underneath it, but I just find that baking paper works a lot easier. Okay. You'll also need, if you've got one, a cooling rack, which you can see underneath here. If you haven't got one, don't worry, it can be done by leaving them on the tray for a little while instead. All right. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make raspberry buns or an alternative of those. So you could make orange-based buns, lemon curd buns, or you could even do chocolate buns. Now, these aren't buns in the traditional cake sense. They are buns which are a cross between a biscuit, a scone, and a cake. So the outside goes firm and crispy. The inside is sort of much more soft but quite dense, so a bit like a cross between a cake and a scone, with your some jam on the top, or marmalade or lemon curd or chocolate chips or chocolate spread for the chocolate versions. Okay, so first off you need to weigh out your ingredients. So you will need a set of scales. Now they can be analog ones, which use traditional sort of balance scales like these 4, or you can use digital ones like this. So in some smallish bowls you'll need to weigh out your ingredients. So in grams, you need 225 grams of self-raising flour. So carefully measure it into a bowl. You could do it into large mugs, whatever sort of receptacle you've got that you can fit it into. So 225 grams, nearly there. A little bit out. There we go. So pop that to one side. Then need another little small bowl to put your sugar into, which is 75 grams of granulated sugar. So again, make sure when you put your bowl on the scales you tear it off, so it says 0. So this we're doing 75 grams, which is roughly 3 or 4 tablespoons worth. See, it wasn't far off. Doesn't matter if you go slightly over, as long as it's only slightly. If it's over big time, then you need to take back off it. There we go. Then into another bowl, tear it off, make sure it says 0. You need to add 75 grams of margarine. Cool, 76 grams, 1 gram over, that's fine, being 1 gram over. Okay, once you've got those, you can then pop your scales to one side, because that's the last thing we're going to have to weigh out. And then you need your larger mixing bowl and sieve if you've got one. If you haven't got a sieve, that's absolutely fine, it's not a problem. You only use a sieve to sieve through the flour, which sort of adds a little bit of air into it. But if you don't have one, it's not a big problem. Okay, so pour your flour into your sieve and then gently, don't be too violent, otherwise it will end up all over the work surface or table. Gently knock it on your hands like I am until you've got nothing left. If you've got a few little crumbs and bits, you can use a spoon like I have just to knock the last bit through. Right, that's done with. That can go for washing, as is the small bowl. Okay, and then once you've done that, if you are making a chocolate version, you will need to, using a tablespoon, which is the big one, so tablespoon compared to a teaspoon, teaspoons are the little ones you stir your tea with, you need to take a tablespoon of flour back out and add a tablespoon of cocoa in. Okay, that's how you transfer the measurements over. So if you want to do chocolate, take a tablespoon of flour out, add a tablespoon of cocoa in. Okay, so once you've sieved your flour, you then need to add the sugar in, which we've got here. So just drop that in and then just stir that in a little bit if you've got a spoon. If you haven't, don't worry, you don't need to necessarily. Okay, and then you need to add the margarine in, and what we now need to do is, using our hands, is we need to rub the margarine into the flour. And what you're slowly doing is distributing the margarine evenly throughout the flour and the sugar until it looks like really, really fine breadcrumbs. And whilst you're rubbing in and you're lifting the flour up and mixing the margarine in, again you are aerating your mix, so helping it to get a bit lighter and not be so dense. Every so often, if you just shake your bowl, you get the larger lumps of fat coming to the top, which helps you to see how evenly it's been distributed throughout. And this should only take you a couple of minutes to rub in the margarine. I've got a few largish lumps. It may look like you've got some large lumps left, but quite often it'll be mix that's just stuck together rather than margarine. But it's worth just picking them up and breaking them just to make sure. Okay, that looks like it's about ready. So knock your hands off, rub them off, get what you can off, and then once you've done that, pop it to one side and just wash your hands. Dry them off. Okay, you then need a mug or a small mixing bowl back, and you'll need 2 medium-sized eggs. Carefully break them into the bowl or mug like I have just there. Make sure there's no shell in them, and then discard the shell in the bin or into the compost, whichever you use. And then with your fork, we're then going to whisk. So it's the same if you did this in the bowl. Until they're relatively evenly beaten, like that. Okay, that's going for the wash. Now, at this point, if you're making the orange version or the lemon version, you can then add in, using your grater, some lemon zest or orange zest. Now, you only need to go as far as the sort of, not all the way down to the white bit basically, you only need to take a very thin layer off. If you go too far down, you hit the white bit, you've got what's called pith, P-I-T-H, and that is quite bitter flavour. So you only need the sort of bright yellow bit from the outside if you're doing a lemon version, and you only need the bright orange bit if you're doing an orange version. Okay? So, once you've cracked them and beaten them, we'll then whisk with a fork. You've done that. And then you need to add about half the mix, or half of the eggs to the mix, sorry. So that's about that. And then using your table knife, so I'm going to use this one, or you can use one like that. Try and find one that hasn't got any serration on it, so any sort of sharp jaggy bits. You want a reasonably smooth but blunt one. And then start to stir the egg in. And you can see it's starting to come together in the middle. If you chuck any over the side, pick it up and pop it back in, because you should have sanitised and cleaned your worktops before starting. Right, I'm going to need the rest of my egg in there now. Depending on the size of your eggs, you may not need all of the egg, but in my case I have done. So if you've got large eggs, you almost certainly will need all of it. If you've got small eggs and it doesn't come completely together, you can add either probably a little bit of the lemon juice if you're doing a lemon version, or a little bit of orange juice if you're doing the orange version, but only a little bit at a time. You don't want to add too much in and make it too wet. Or you can add a little bit of milk to it. Milk is a nice thing to use as a binding agent in cakes. Right, now we've got to this point. You can see there's some breadcrumby bits around the edges still. But once I get my hands in there, the slightly wetter patches that I can see, that'll all mix together. So this is where we get our hands back in and start trying to bring it together into one nice lump. And it'll feel quite gritty and quite grainy initially, but as you mix it a little bit more with your hands, it'll all start to come together. Okay, now you'll need a little bit of spare flour so that you can sprinkle it on top of the worktop. Just like that. And then you can take your mix out of your bowl and pop it on the worktop. Any excess that's in the bowl, you can scrape out and add. Waste not, want not. Okay, and then your bowl can go for washing because we don't need that anymore. Okay, and then just with your hands, carefully, not too violently, just start to roll it round and mixing it together a little bit more evenly. If you need any more flour, just add a bit more to the work surface. And then we need to roll this into a cylinder shape. So if you think about what a Pringles tin's like, a Pringles tin is a cylinder, okay? So it needs to be just a bit narrower, so probably about this round, which isn't as big as a Pringles tin obviously, but we need to try and make it into a relatively even cylinder. And we just roll until it's even. So you can see now that's quite nice and even there. Okay, it is quite a soft mix, so just be really gentle with it, okay? So you will now need your baking trays back, depending on what size you're using. And then a piece of paper on each of them. Okay, and now this mix should do you roughly 10 cookies. So to do it evenly, you could find the middle, which is roughly there, and then divide each of these halves into 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Same thing in the opposite direction. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Brilliant. So now that we've got our 10, you can just go and cut through the mix. And as you cut through each one, take it and shape it back into a roundish shape. Okay, like that. And then pop it on your tray. Now the formation that you can do on a tray is what I term a 2-1-2-1-2. So you do 2 that are reasonably well spaced apart, and once they're on the tray you can press them down a little bit as well and flatten them out slightly. They will flatten in the oven as well, but this just helps to make them a bit more even. Okay, so that's your first 2. Then we're going to do the 1, which is going to go in the middle just below the 2. And this is so that you don't have too many too close together that spread out when you're cooking them and they end up sticking together. If your trays are smaller, you might end up doing 5 or 6 on a tray, so doing the 2, 1, 2 and 1. But because I've got large trays, I can get 8 on a tray. A bit close to the edge of the tray, so I'll move it up a little bit. Okay, so I'll just pop that to the side and I'll finish those off in a minute on the other tray. So what you now need to do is you now need the wooden spoon, and we're using this end of it. You could also just use a finger. So what you need to do is, using the end of the spoon, is press slightly into the middle of your cookie and make a sort of little mini crater. So that's why with a finger you can do exactly the same thing, as you can see there. But it's up to you what you have and what you choose to use. Okay. So go around each one and make a little crater in the middle. Okay, and then you want your teaspoon, which is the little one, and your choice of jam. So I've got some homemade raspberry jam here. If you're doing a lemon version, you can use lemon curd. If you're doing an orange version, you can use marmalade or orange curd as well. And then with the teaspoon, you just need to get, if I just mix this up slightly because it's quite juicy, you just need to get a little bit on your teaspoon and just pop it in the crater. Don't put too much in because you don't want it to boil over too much or boil out. So you don't need a whole teaspoon's worth, basically. It's just to add a little bit of flavour to them. Okay, pop that to one side. Now these are ready to go into the oven. They need to go into a preheated oven at about 175 degrees centigrade or gas mark 4 roughly. But for cooking cakes, most people will know what temperature their oven likes. So using oven gloves to open the door and put your tray in, and then they need to be cooked for about 15 minutes. So After about 7 minutes, 8 minutes, if you want to, you can turn them round. Depends on how evenly your oven cooks. If not, leave them in for a full 15 minutes. Okay. And I will be back to show you the finished versions in a few minutes. Good luck. Right, now if you're doing the chocolate version, what you need to do is you need to get a tablespoon, which is the big one, and take a tablespoon of flour out, and then add a tablespoon of cocoa in. Okay, just like that, and then that's your chocolate version. And then I'll show you what you can do to put a topping on in a little while. Right, so chocolate versions are exactly the same process as the raspberry versions or lemon versions or orange versions, whatever you've done. But obviously they've got cocoa added to the mix, so they're a lot darker. So again, make them into your rounds and flatten them out slightly. And sit them on the tray. I should be able to get all of these on the tray. I've got some on another tray, so that's why I'm one short, unlike others. Okay. And then, same as you did for the others, make your dimples in the middle. But instead of adding like a jam, you could even do a raspberry chocolate and raspberry version of these. That'd be quite nice. You can either use a smallish chunk of chocolate, not too much, because again you don't want it to run out and run over. You could use a teaspoon or a little bit of chocolate spread of some description, but I've got a load of chocolate chips that I'm going to use. So I've got dark chocolate, milk chocolate and white chocolate, and you want to add about 5 into each of the little divots. I think that'll be about right. So I'm just trying to put a mixture in there of different chocolates. Try not to get too much of one specific chocolate in each one, and just mixing it up a little bit. And hopefully they will melt together and look really, really yummy. Oh, a few too many in there. Have a dark one, and we'll have a milk chocolate one. That's only got 4. There we go. Right, how many's that got? 3. Can't count clearly. There we go. So there's 5 on each of those. Okay, so that's like your other ones would be just using the chocolate instead.